The inventory room at the back of Dock 7 was exactly the kind of place people forgot existed. It had no windows, no terminals worth using, and a ventilation system that clicked every 40 seconds like a metronome nobody had asked for. Wren liked it for exactly these reasons. She had been assigned to cross-reference the fuel manifest against the actual container logs for the third time that week, which meant she had been assigned to sit quietly with a datapad while the rest of the station held its collective breath. She did not know what the rest of the station was holding its breath about. That was also fine with her. The fuel manifest was wrong in the same small way it had been wrong for 6 months. 17 containers listed as Grade 4 coolant that were actually Grade 4 coolant with a 0.2% variance in the mineral suspension ratio. Nobody cared about the variance. The variance did not affect performance. But the manifest said one thing and the actual content said another, and Wren was the kind of person who could not leave that alone. She made a note. She always made a note. Whether anyone ever read her notes was a separate question. The click of the ventilation came and went. She turned to the next page. The door opened without warning. Wren looked up, which was unusual because she never looked up from the manifest unless something broke. The person standing in the doorway was Gavitt, one of the junior coordinators, and he was wearing an expression she had not seen on him before. He was a man who communicated primarily through low-level annoyance, but this was different. This was the face of someone who had seen something and had not yet found the right category for it. "They're asking for a technical assessor," he said. "For what?" He pressed his lips together. "The docking ring, main approach corridor, you need to see it yourself." Wren put the datapad down with the corner precisely aligned to the edge of the table, the way she always did, because she was not the kind of person who left things at angles. She followed Gavitt out into the corridor and through the 2 pressure doors that separated the supply section from the main station body. The station was called Meridian Post, which was a name that suggested importance it had never quite earned. It was a mid-tier waypoint on the Kareth shipping lane, useful, functional, and as interesting as a well-maintained road. It was staffed by approximately 300 people whose primary relationship with excitement was hopping to avoid it. The main approach corridor was full of those people. Not all 300, but enough that Wren had to move sideways through clusters of them, all of them standing very still and facing the same direction. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, which was not useful in a crowd, but she was patient, and her elbows were more assertive than her voice. She reached the observation rail. The viewport showed the standard approach lane, the dark between stars, the faint shimmer of the lane markers, the usual distant scatter of traffic transponders. And then, at the very edge of visible range, something that was not standard at all. It was too large. That was the first thing her brain managed. Not too large for space, space had no scale, but too large for what she expected to see in an approach corridor meant for cargo haulers and courier ships. The object resolved slowly as the station's passive sensors pulled it closer on the secondary display to her left. It had the shape of something that had been designed by people who were not interested in looking approachable. Long, dark, with structures along its spine that did not resemble anything in the standard vessel classification guides she had memorized as part of her assessor certification. Human-built, that was the notation on the secondary display. IFF confirmed, but the class field was blank. The crowd was very quiet. Wren noticed that she was holding her datapad against her chest with both hands, and she made herself lower it. The ventilation in the corridor also clicked every 40 seconds. She had never noticed that before. It clicked now. "What classification?" she asked, to no one in particular. "That's what nobody knows," Gavitt said, from somewhere behind her left shoulder. "The registration code is real, verified through the Interstellar Commerce Authority, but the class designation doesn't exist in any public registry. It has to exist somewhere." "Sure, just not anywhere we can see." Ren looked at the shape on the display. She was an assessor. Her job was to look at things carefully and report accurately on what she found. She was good at it precisely because she did not embellish and she did not minimize. She looked at the thing in the approach corridor and she thought, "That is a very large ship." She thought, "Whoever built that had a specific purpose in mind." She thought, the purpose was not comfort. And then, because she was also the kind of person who noticed small things, she noticed the transponder signal on the secondary display was not broadcasting the standard navigation ping. It was broadcasting something else, a maintenance frequency, an internal station use channel. As if whatever was out there had already been here before, as if it knew the codes. A low sound moved through the crowd, not fear exactly, more like the collective intake of breath that happens when something very large moves in a direction you did not expect. On the display, the object had altered its approach vector. It was no longer heading for the main docking ring. It was heading for the secondary bay, the one currently occupied by nothing but 17 containers of grade 4 coolant, with a 0.2% variance in mineral suspension. The one accessible directly from Dock 7. Ren turned and walked back the way she had come. Behind her, she heard Gavik call her name in a tone that suggested he expected her to stop. She did not stop. She had left her datapad on a table with the corner precisely aligned, and whatever was coming in through the secondary bay, someone was going to need to document it correctly. She was already composing the notation in her head. The secondary bay received one vessel, class unknown. IFF confirmed human registry. Time of arrival. She checked her watch and wrote the numbers down before she even reached the door. She pushed through into Dock 7, and the ventilation clicked and she stood at the edge of the platform and looked up at the shape that was slowly, with extraordinary precision, fitting itself through the bay doors that had been designed for something a fraction of its size. It fit, just barely. The clearance on either side was less than a meter. Whoever was piloting that thing had done it deliberately. The landing struts extended. They were not the kind of struts she recognized. The ramp came down, and something she had no category for looked out at her from the top of it. She wrote the time again. Her handwriting was very steady. It always was. The creature at the top of the ramp did not move immediately. Ren was aware of this because she was watching it the way she watched everything, steadily, without flinching, without any particular expression on her face. It was approximately 3 meters tall in a configuration that suggested standing was a choice it made rather than a default. Its body had a lateral symmetry that was almost familiar, 2 primary limbs high on the torso, 2 lower, a distinct head structure, and then the almost familiarity ended. Its surface shifted between states that Ren's eyes kept trying to categorize as either skin or armor and kept failing at, settling on something in between, a texture like cooled mineral resin that moved when it breathed. Its head carried no eyes she could identify. What it had instead were 2 elongated structures along the upper facial ridge that caught the bay lighting and redirected it inward, like lenses ground wrong on purpose. It was looking at her. She was reasonably certain of that. She was also reasonably certain she was the only person in the bay, because the general announcement to evacuate Dock 7 had played approximately 90 seconds ago, and she had not left. This had been a decision. She was still examining whether it had been a good one. The creature descended the ramp. It moved with a kind of deliberate economy, each step placed as though the floor had been checked in advance and found acceptable. When it reached the bottom, it stopped at a distance she estimated as 8 meters and produced a sound from somewhere in its chest, a low harmonic in 2 frequencies simultaneously, like 2 notes played on instruments that had no names. Ren looked at her datapad. The station's translation relay was a standard installation, adequate for all 47 species currently registered in the Karath Commerce Treaty. She activated it on her wrist panel and held it toward the creature. The translation relay produced a soft negative tone. She lowered her wrist. The creature had not moved. The two-frequency sound came again, slightly different in the second note. "I'm sorry," Ren said. "I don't have translation for whatever language that is." The creature's upper limbs shifted, not toward her, sideways slightly, in a motion that her body interpreted as a shrug before her brain could check that interpretation. Then it did something unexpected. It reached into a compartment on the inner surface of its right upper limb and withdrew a small object. Flat, approximately the size and shape of a standard cargo label. It held the object out. Ren walked the 8 meters. She was aware that this was probably not what station protocol recommended. She was also aware that she was the one who was still in the bay, and that having walked this far, walking 8 meters more was not meaningfully different in terms of commitment. She took the object. It was a manifest, formatted in the Karath standard system, accurate to 3 decimal places, listing the contents of the ship's cargo bay in units she recognized. Coolant, mineral suspension compounds, specifically grade 4 with a 0.2% variance ratio. She looked up at the creature. It had not moved, but the lens structures on its face had oriented more directly at her, and there was something in the angle of them that she could not name but filed carefully in memory. It was not threat. It was something more like the expression a person makes when they have been carrying something heavy and have finally found a place to set it down. She looked back at the manifest. At the bottom, below the cargo listing, was a single line in a script she did not know, and below that the same line rendered in translation standard, a question simply phrased. It read, "Is this the station that has been nodding the variance?" Ren stood very still for a moment. The ventilation clicked. "Yes," she said, "that's me." The creature made a third sound. Different again, shorter, with something rising in the second frequency that she did not have a word for, but that her body, before her brain could intervene, interpreted as relief. She did not write that down, but she remembered it. The creature's name, as best the translation relay could approximate it 3 days later when Gavitt had finally located someone with partial familiarity with the language family, was something close to Varl. It was not the creature's full designation. That was considerably longer and involved frequencies the relay could not render, but it accepted Varl as a working reference with what Ren had come to recognize as its minimal acknowledgement posture. A small compression of the upper torso, almost nothing, the equivalent of a nod from something that did not have a head structure designed for nodding. 3 days. That was how long it had taken to establish basic communication, and even basic was generous. They had a vocabulary of approximately 60 functional words, and a grammar that both of them were quietly inventing as they went, feeling for rules the way you feel for the edge of a table in a dark room. The ship had not left. Nobody had asked it to leave, which was partly because nobody at Meridian Post had any authority to ask a Titan-class warship to do anything, and partly because the thing had not been aggressive, had not demanded anything, had not done anything at all except occupy the secondary bay and periodically offer Ren the manifest as though checking that it was still legible. She had stopped going home to her quarters at night. She had set up her datapad station near the bay entrance, in a corner with a good sightline and access to the station's secondary power conduit. The creature Varl seemed to have noticed this and adjusted its own resting position so that it was roughly equidistant between the ship's ramp and the place where Ren worked, as though they had silently agreed on a neutral zone. The station administration had not formally assigned her to this situation. She had simply not stopped being there, and eventually the administration had begun routing all communications about the vessel through her datapad, which she took as a form of acknowledgement. On the morning of the 4th day, an official communication arrived from the Karath Commerce Authority, copied to 7 other bodies whose names occupied the full subject line. The substance of it was that the vessel in Dock 7 was of a class not registered in any treaty-accessible database, that its presence at a treaty waypoint created jurisdictional questions that needed resolution, and that a formal inquiry team would arrive within 9 days. Ren read this twice. Then she walked to the edge of the platform and stood in Varl's line of sight, which was how she had found it was best to begin a conversation. The creature oriented toward her. The lens structures caught the light. She held up the datapad with the communication visible on the screen, knowing it could not read it, knowing the gesture was mostly hers. Then she said, in their 60-word vocabulary, the closest approximation she had built for, "People are coming who will have authority over this." Varl was still for a long moment. Then it made a sound she had not heard before, 3 frequencies this time, braided together in a way that made her think of something tightly held, though she could not have said why. It turned and walked back up the ramp, not away. She had learned the difference, not away in to retrieve something. It came back with a second object, not a manifest this time, something smaller, sealed in a casing she did not recognize. It held the object at the level of her face, carefully, with the focused attention it gave to things it considered significant, and then it set it on the platform beside her. She picked it up. The casing was warm from being held. It was the first time she had touched something that Varl had been carrying, and the warmth of it was surprising, not unpleasant, just startling in the way that real things are startling when you have been thinking of them only in terms of categories. She did not open it immediately. She held it and looked at Varl, and Varl looked at her with the lens structures that caught light and turned it inward, and she thought, there is a reason this was kept separate from the manifest. There is a reason it is being given now and not before. She said in their vocabulary, "What is this?" Varl said, the word it used translated to something between reason and account, a word for the story that explains why a thing was done. The communication from the Commerce Authority sat on her datapad with 7 copied addresses in the subject line, and 9 days before the inquiry team arrived, and 60 words in a shared vocabulary, and a warm sealed object she had not opened yet. She thought about the 0.2% variance in the coolant suspension ratio that she had been noting for 6 months in reports that nobody had read. Somebody had read them. That was the problem and the beginning, and possibly something more than either of those things. She set the object carefully beside the datapad and went back to the manifest and started reading again from the beginning. The case inside the sealed object was not difficult to open, once she stopped trying to open it the way she would open a standard cargo seal, and instead paid attention to the shape of the closure. 2 interlocking pieces that wanted to be rotated in opposite directions simultaneously, a design that assumed 2 hands capable of independent force at the same moment. Human hands could do this. She suspected that was not accidental. Inside was a document, not a data chip, not a projection file, a physical document, printed on a material that was not paper but held the same kind of density, the same sense of permanence. The text was in Kareth standard on one side and in the unreadable script from the manifest's bottom line on the other. She read the Kareth side. It was a petition, formally structured, addressed to no specific authority, addressed instead to any station of record operating within the Kareth Treaty Zone, which was a legal category she had to look up and which turned out to mean any station whose logs were recognized as official documentation. Meridian Post qualified. Her logs qualified. The petition described a cargo of 17 units of Grade 4 coolant compound with a specific mineral suspension formulation that was no longer produced anywhere in the registered supply chain because the compound's primary synthetic precursor had been removed from the approved materials list in the last Commerce Authority revision, on the grounds that its production created trace molecular waste that fell under the treaty's environmental contamination threshold. The removal had taken effect 8 months ago. The 17 units currently in Meridian Post Secondary Bay were among the last existing stock of the compound, which was the only substance capable of stabilizing a specific type of long-chain polymer seal, used exclusively in the hull construction of vessels built by Varl's people, who called themselves something that the translation relay rendered as the Settled, a name which carried connotations of both permanence and deliberate choice. The hull seal failures had already begun. 2 ships in the 6 months since the removal. Not catastrophic, not yet, but measurable, and measurable meant predictable, and predictable in this case meant bad. The petition requested that the coolant compound be reclassified as an essential material for an existing population's infrastructure maintenance, which under a specific subsection of the Commerce Treaty would exempt it from the contamination threshold removal. The petition needed to be filed by a station of record. It needed a human signature, because the treaty's foundational protocols had been written when humans were the primary drafting party, and certain classes of petition were only recognized when submitted by a registered human official. Wren read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the document for a while without reading it. The ventilation clicked. She thought about the 6 months of notes she had been making about the variants. She thought about the fact that Varl had known those notes existed. She thought about what it meant that a ship the size of a geographical feature had come to a mid-tier waypoint staffed by 300 people who primarily tried to avoid excitement, and had asked the one person whose job was to document small discrepancies to document a larger one. She thought about the inquiry team that was arriving in 8 days. She walked to the platform edge. Varl was in its resting position near the base of the ramp, which was a configuration she had started to think of as its neutral state, not inactive, just present, occupying space without demanding anything from it. When she arrived at the platform edge, it oriented toward her without what she had come to recognize as urgency. She had a theory that urgency was not a default mode for Varl's people, that it was something only entered under specific conditions, and not lightly. She held up the document. Varl was still. She said in the 60 words, "I understand what this asks." Varl made no sound. The lens structures caught the bay lighting and held it. She said, "I am not an official, I am an assessor, I document things." Varl said a word she had not heard before. She looked it up in the rough lexicon they had been building together on her secondary datapad, and it was not there, because they had not needed it yet. She asked for it again, and Varl said it again, and she tried to trace its components from the words she did know and arrived, slowly and not entirely confidently, at something like, "the one who makes the record that others are required to notice." She stood with that for a while. "That's a very specific definition," she said, in words Varl could not understand. She wrote it down anyway. She had 7 days before the inquiry team arrived. She looked at the document. She looked at the 17 containers of grade 4 coolant with the 0.2% variance in mineral suspension ratio. She looked at Varl, who had traveled an unspecified distance in a ship that had frightened an entire station into collective breath-holding in order to give a document to a person whose job was to write things down. She made a note. She always made a note. She began drafting the petition. The inquiry team arrived a day early. This was not, in Wren's experience, a good sign. Early arrival in a regulatory context typically meant the matter had been elevated above its initial classification, and someone with more seniority had decided to come personally rather than send a junior assessor. The ship that docked in the main ring at 400 was a mid-class administrative cruiser with the Commerce Authority seal on its hull, and the person who walked off it at 600 was a man named Director Soval, whose name Wren recognized from the footer of approximately 43 formal policy documents she had read in the past 3 years. She met him in the main corridor outside the administration suite, because nobody else had been awake at 600 except her, and she had been awake because she had not slept. Soval was a compact man with the specific posture of someone who had spent years in rooms where posture mattered. He looked at her with the expression of a person calculating the difficulty of the situation they had walked into. "You're the assessor," he said. "Yes." "The one who's been in contact with the vessel?" "Yes." He looked past her toward the corridor that led to Dock 7. "The station logs show you've been in the secondary bay almost continuously for 4 days." "I've been documenting the situation," Wren said. "That's my function." "Your function is to document cargo manifests." The cargo manifest for the vessel in the secondary bay was the initial point of contact, she said. The situation expanded from there. Sovil looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite hostile, but was the precursor to something that could become hostile given the right conditions. Then he said, "We need to talk about the petition you filed." "It's a valid filing," Wren said. "Meridian Post is a registered station of record. The petition meets the formal requirements under subsection 17 of the treaty's Material Exemption Protocol. The petition was filed without authorization from station administration. The treaty protocol doesn't require administration authorization for a filing by a registered assessor at a station of record." Sovil was quiet for a moment. She had the impression he had known this and had been hoping she had not. The petition, if accepted, would reverse a Commerce Authority materials decision. It would reclassify one compound under an existing exemption that was designed for exactly this situation. "There are concerns," he said, "about the nature of the vessel, about what it represents. There are parties within the authority who feel that the arrival of an unregistered Titan-class ship at a treaty waypoint is not a simple supply matter." Wren looked at him steadily. "Do you want to see the manifest?" The inspection Sovil conducted of the secondary bay lasted 2 hours. He brought 2 colleagues from the administrative cruiser, both of them specialists in treaty compliance, and they moved through the bay with the focused attention of people doing a job they had done many times in many different places. Varl was present throughout. It had returned to its resting position at the base of the ramp and did not move from it. When Sovil's colleagues moved closer to examine the ship's hull markings, it tracked them with the lens structures but did not rise. Wren watched Sovil watch Varl. She had developed, over 4 days, a particular sensitivity to the small signals that Varl's body produced when it was in a state she had come to think of as watchful endurance, the state of being in a situation that required patience rather than action, where the available options were fewer than desired, and the outcome was not in one's direct control. She recognized it because she had spent considerable time in that state herself. She recognized it in Varl now. Sovil turned to her. "It hasn't done anything," he said. "This was not entirely a question. It arrived. It presented documentation. It waited. It didn't make demands." "No." He looked back at Varl. The 2 colleagues had moved away from the hull and were consulting something on a shared datapad. "The compound in those containers," Sovil said. "If the exemption isn't granted, what happens to the petition?" "It lapses," Wren said. "The containers get classified under standard environmental hold and go into regulatory storage pending disposal review." "And the vessel?" "Leaves," she said. "I assume. It came for the coolant and for the petition. If neither happens, there's nothing here." Sovil was quiet. One of his colleagues said something to him in a low voice. He listened, nodded once, and said something back. Then he turned to Wren and said, "The petition creates a precedent for granting material exemptions to populations whose infrastructure depends on treaty-regulated compounds." "Yes. That's what the subsection was written to create precedent for. Other parties may use it." "Other parties in the same situation may use it," she said. "That's how exemption protocols work. They're not population-specific. They establish categories." He looked at her with the calculating expression again. She had the sense he was trying to find the point of failure in her argument, the gap in the protocol, the technical error that would allow him to send the petition back unfiled. She had spent 3 days making sure there were none. "You drafted this yourself," he said. "Yes. In 4 days. I work quickly when the problem is specific." He turned back to look at Varl once more, and Varl was looking at him, or doing whatever the lens structures did that functioned as looking, and the bay was very quiet except for the ventilation clicking at its 40-second interval. Something shifted in Soval's posture. A small thing, a settling, a release of some held position. She recognized it without knowing how. She thought, "He came here expecting to rescind the petition and he is not going to." He said, "The inquiry team's formal report will note the petition as validly filed under the applicable protocol." She said, "I know." He said, "It will take time for the full exemption review." "I know that too." He looked at her for a moment with something that was not admiration exactly, but was in that direction. "You're going to keep documenting this," he said. "That's my function," she said. He almost smiled. It was a very small almost. Then he walked back toward the bay entrance and his colleagues followed, and Wren stood at the edge of the platform and did not move. She heard behind her the 2-frequency sound. Low, unhurried. Not the sounds from their first meeting, not the braided 3-frequency sound of something held tightly. This was different. She had not heard this one before, and she stood still for a moment before she turned to face it. Varl had not moved from the base of the ramp, but it was making the sound, and there was something in the second frequency that rose and then descended and then rose again, in a pattern she thought about for a moment, and then thought about again. She said in their 60-word vocabulary, "I do not know this word." Varl said it again. Then it did something it had not done before. It reached up with one of its upper limbs and pressed a flat palm against the side of the ship's hull, just rested it there briefly, before lowering the limb back to its side. She stood very still and thought about this. The ship, the hull, the compound in 17 containers that the hull needed, the petition that was now validly filed, the sound that rose and fell and rose. She thought she understood. She would look it up later to confirm, but she thought she understood. She said in their 60-word vocabulary the word that in her language meant, "given back." Varl made the sound once more, and then was quiet, and the bay settled back into its ordinary noises. The exemption review took 11 weeks. Wren knew this because she was still there when it concluded, which she knew Gavitt found baffling, and the station administration had stopped questioning, because her documentation of the entire situation had become the foundational record for what turned out to be a genuinely complicated regulatory matter that 7 separate treaty bodies eventually had opinions about. She had become, by a process she had not planned, the person whose logs everyone needed. The coolant remained in the containers in the secondary bay. Varl remained on the ship. The ship remained in Dock 7. Wren remained at her corner station, with the good sightline to the bay. She and Varl had approximately 240 words now, and a grammar that was real enough to navigate most practical things and some impractical ones. Varl had shown her the inside of the ship once, the cargo sections, and the engineering areas it seemed to consider acceptable for her to see, and she had shown it the station's external sensor array, which it had examined with the focused attention it gave to things it considered significant. They had eaten in the same space 3 times, which was not eating together because Varl's nutritional requirements were entirely different from hers, but was the deliberate choice to occupy the same space during a biological process that both of them needed to perform regardless, which felt like it meant something even if she did not have a word for what. When the exemption review concluded in favor of reclassification, the notification came through Wren's datapad at 300 in the morning. She had been asleep, finally, after a long session of documentation review. She woke up and read it twice, and then sat with it for a moment in the dark of her quarters, which she had returned to approximately 3 weeks ago, though she still spent most of her time in the bay. She went down at 400. Varl was in its resting position. She stood at the platform edge and Varl oriented toward her, and she held up the datapad and said, in their 240-word vocabulary, the thing that meant. The petition was accepted. Varl was still for a long moment. Then it made a sound she had not heard in 11 weeks. The one she had looked up and confirmed, eventually, meant given back, or more precisely the act of returning something to a condition it was meant to be in. The loading of the 17 containers began the next morning. Varl operated the loading equipment from inside the ship with a precision she observed carefully and documented thoroughly, because that was what she did. It took 6 hours. She spent the 6 hours writing notes. Some of them were about the loading process. Some of them were about other things, the kind of notes that she put in a secondary file she did not formally log anywhere, because not everything needed to be on the official record. By evening, the cargo was loaded. The ramp was still down. She stood on the platform, and Varl stood at the top of the ramp, and neither of them said anything for a little while, because the vocabulary was adequate for most things but not entirely for this one. She said in their shared words, "Will the seals hold?" Varl said, "Yes, for a long time with this." She said, "Will there be other ships?" Varl said the word that meant, "This is not the last," and then it said something else, in the part of the vocabulary they were still building, and she had to ask it to say it again, which it did more slowly, and she worked out that it meant something like, "The record will say the right name." She thought about that. She said, "Whose name?" Varl looked at her with the lens structures that caught light and turned it inward and said, "The one who makes the record that others are required to notice." She stood on the platform for a moment longer. The ramp was still down. Varl was still there. She said, "Travel well." Varl made the 2-frequency sound, the one from the very beginning, but different now, because things were different now, and the bay absorbed it, and she stood and listened to the shape of it until it ended. The ramp came up. The bay doors opened. The ship moved out with the same extraordinary precision with which it had arrived, with less than a meter of clearance on each side, fitting through a space that had been built for something smaller as though it had always known the dimensions. She stood on the platform until the ship was gone and the bay doors had closed, and the secondary bay was empty, except for 17 empty container cradles and the ordinary noise of the station. Then she sat down at her corner station with the good sightline and opened her datapad and started writing. The inventory room at the back of Dock 7 had no windows. It had a ventilation system that clicked every 40 seconds. On the table by the door, there was a small object in a sealed casing, left there with the corner precisely aligned, which was not how Wren had left it, but which was how it was now, and she noticed this and made a note of it, because she noticed small things, because that was what she was for, because some work was done one careful observation at a time, and the record would say the right name.